7 attitudes for proprietary thinking in intellectual property. The Son of God left us with the Beatitudes for godly living. In intellectual property, if you don't fashion your attitude alongside one or a combination of these attitudes, you're going to fail. You just don't know it yet. Proprietary simply means aspect and extent of ownership. There is an aspect of ownership in the things that you've created that you should stake a claim on, and there is an extent of ownership in the things that you've created that you should equally stake a claim on. Your ownership in whatsoever you have created is never absolute. There are always intervening factors that will depend what aspect and what extent of ownership you can claim on the things that you've created. You will be shocked how many people at the marketplace don't even own their logos. The people who have exclusive ownership over your logo might still be the cyber guy who did the logo for you or a graphic designer somewhere. The responsibility in intellectual property is whatever is associated with you, you should stake a claim on. And when you're doing that, it's called proprietary thinking. This is the first attitude that you and I should sustain at all times. Number 1, your intellectual property is your raw material. That's very important. At some point, this sweater was a wool on a ship somewhere, but it has gone through different processes to arrive at this sweater. Intellectual property, whatever form, ought to be approached as a raw material. If you are an architect, the blueprints that you originate are merely raw materials. If you are a fashion designer, the design is merely a raw material. It's not the end result. It's merely a raw material. If you are a composer, that melody, the song, the instrumentation, merely forms of raw material. So intellectual property is a raw material that ought to be converted into its own industry. Anything that is not converted into an industry is wasted intellectual property. Attitude number 2, your intellectual property is your unfair advantage. If I was to rely on the fact that I went to law school to be doing this content, then any person who went to law school can equalize that competitiveness and equally do or compete with me at this content. I don't do this content because I went to law school. That is an added advantage. I do this content because I created something. I am the creator and inventor of proprietary operational capacity thresholds. Regardless of what school you went to, regardless to what extent you went to, you cannot compete with me on proprietary operational capacity thresholds. That gives me unfair advantage. Similarly, in the things that you've created, you need to identify where does my unfair advantage lie. That is very important. We don't need to compete at competitive advantages. We need to compete in things that people cannot even imagine. When you are arriving at that point, it's called unfair advantages. The third attitude that we should sustain at all times is your intellectual property is an economic resource. There is much more to intellectual property than merely protecting something. There is much more to intellectual property than merely showing a trademark certificate or a copyright certificate. Intellectual property at their base have economic values. That means whatever you have created, you should be able to value, because intellectual property should help you generate wealth. The only way you can generate wealth from your intellectual property is when you have identified it as a form of economic value or economic resource. The fourth attitude that we should sustain is your intellectual property is an equalizer. What that simply means is intellectual property equalizes all of us. What I usually like to say is intellectual property is not a respecter of persons. What intellectual property has done for company X, intellectual property can do for you, not necessarily in a similar manner, but your intellectual property can go to work on your behalf. That is the equalizing power of intellectual property. As far as intellectual property is concerned, gender does not matter. As far as intellectual property is concerned, geographical locations don't matter. As far as intellectual property is concerned, your academic backgrounds don't matter. Intellectual property can go to work on your behalf regardless of what you might feel that these are my inadequacies at the marketplace. Intellectual property is the greatest equalizer under the sun. The other attitude that we need to sustain at all times is that your intellectual property is a form of labor. In any marketplace, there is only one constant: labor must at all times be rewarded. Intellectual property must be rewarded, and the reward matrix, who determines, is the owner, the bearer of intellectual property. It's one of the reasons why if you appear at the marketplace, then you need to fall in love with your intellectual property to determine the reward matrix. The reward matrix are determined by the bearer, not the market. The market forces don't have influence over an individual that has proprietary awareness over what they have created. Your intellectual property is a form of labor. The sixth attitude is your intellectual property is your estate. It forms part of your wealth. Majority of us, whenever we are putting out or whenever we are considering our wealth, we never factor intellectual property. We don't factor our academic writings. We don't factor our logos. Your intellectual property should form part of your estate, because your intellectual property is part of your wealth portfolio. The last and not the least attitude is that your intellectual property is the only form of resource that never depreciates in economic value. This one helps us to factor generational wealth mindsets. That if I can rely on my logo today, my logo can outlive me, my logo will outlive my children, my logo will outlive my children's children until the Lord returns. That's a very important attitude. Intellectual property should outlive all of us. Whenever we are conducting some of our trainings, and I always tell people that a typical copyright should last you 275 years. So it's important for us to understand, if the copyright in what I've created should be in my family for 275 years, what manner of thought should I support it with? It's important that we approach it from that attitude. These 7 attitudes for proprietary thinking will make you have informed decisions and informed choices at the marketplace. My name is Omuga Ogwang, and I'm the principal at Franchise and Licensing Institute. And if you need help with one or a combination of these attitudes, whether in business or career, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We are interested to help you put in place mechanisms that will help you unlock these attitudes. I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care. God bless. Bye-bye.